War has many faces. History remembers the generals in their command tents, the pilots in their cockpits, and the infantrymen in the mud. But amidst the grand strategy and industrial slaughter of the Second World War, there were other participants, unwilling, unwitting, and often overlooked. They wore no uniforms and swore no oaths, yet their service was absolute. Among them, one stood apart. She was not a tool of war, nor a beast of burden. She was a liver and white English pointer named Judy, and her story begins not on a battlefield, but in the bustling, chaotic streets of Shanghai in the late 1930s. Before the world caught fire, the crew of the British gunboat HMS Nat found themselves stationed on the Yangtze River. It was a tense, lonely assignment, far from home and rife with the threat of river pirates. The men needed something to break the monotony, a distraction from the humid air and the muddy water. They found their answer in a local kennel. She was a high-spirited puppy, born to prize-winning parents, but her destiny lay far from dog shows and manicured lawns. The sailors pooled their money, voted unanimously, and brought her aboard. They listed her in the ship's log as a mascot, but she would quickly prove to be much more than a morale booster. Life on a gunboat was a hazardous existence, and Judy took to it with the natural instincts of a seasoned sailor. She didn't just tolerate the swaying deck, she patrolled it. The crew soon realized that their new recruit possessed sensors far more sophisticated than anything the Royal Navy had bolted to the ship's hull. The Yangtze was treacherous, often shrouded in thick fog that blinded the watchman. But Judy could not be blinded. She would stand at the bow, her body rigid, her nose twitching as she dissected the air. When Judy pointed, the men learned to listen. Long before the human ear could detect the splash of an oar or the low hum of an engine, Judy knew they were not alone. She became the ship's primary early warning system against river pirates attempting to board under the cover of darkness. If she barked at the empty blackness of the river, the spotlights were engaged immediately. She was rarely wrong. Her ears were also tuned to the sky. She could distinguish the heavy drone of Japanese aircraft long before they broke through the cloud cover, sending the crew to battle stations minutes ahead of the official alarms. In a game where seconds meant the difference between life and death, Judy was buying them time. As the political landscape of Asia darkened and the Imperial Japanese Army began its aggressive expansion, the HMS Nat was ordered to redeploy. Judy, however, was transferred to a larger vessel, the HMS Grasshopper. By now, she was no longer just a pet. She was a recognized member of the crew, treated with a mix of affection and genuine professional respect. She had her own hammock, her own bowl, and the fierce protection of every man on board. By early 1942, the Grasshopper was stationed in Singapore. The city, once considered an impregnable fortress of the British Empire, was teetering on the brink of collapse. The air was thick with the smoke of burning oil reserves and the terrified rumors of an unstoppable Japanese advance. The calm patrols of the Yangtze were a distant memory, replaced by the deafening roar of relentless aerial bombardment. Judy roamed the decks of the Grasshopper as it prepared for the inevitable evacuation. She could sense the anxiety radiating from the men she loved. The smells of the ship had changed, replaced by the acrid scent of fear and cordite. The sailors, usually quick with a scratch behind the ears or a playful game, were grim-faced and hurried. They were preparing to run the gauntlet, to break out of Singapore before the trap snapped shut. Judy stood at the rail, looking out over the burning harbour, unaware that the ship beneath her feet would soon become a tomb, and that her true war, a war of survival against impossible odds, was only just beginning. February 1942 brought with it the collapse of the British Empire in the East. Singapore, the island fortress, was crumbling under the relentless assault of the Imperial Japanese Army. The harbour was a graveyard of burning ships, and the sky was a permanent bruise of black smoke. The order was given to evacuate. The HMS Grasshopper, laden with Marines, sailors, and civilians, cast off its lines and made a desperate run for the open sea. They were trying to reach the Dutch East Indies, a sanctuary that felt 1,000,000 miles away. For the first few hours, it seemed they might slip through the net. But the Japanese air superiority was absolute. On the morning of February 14th, the sky above the Banker Strait filled with the drone of enemy bombers. The Grasshopper, a small river gunboat, was never designed to fight off a squadron of modern aircraft. She was a sitting duck in open water. The attack was swift and brutal. Bombs whistled down, bracketing the ship before finding their mark. Explosions tore through the hull, shattering steel and igniting the fuel stores. The Grasshopper didn't just sink, she was erased. The order to abandon ship was barely audible over the roar of the inferno. Men jumped into waters that were already slick with leaking oil and flaming debris. In the chaos, Judy was separated from her handlers. The explosion had thrown her clear, or perhaps she had jumped, but now she was paddling frantically in the churning ocean. For a dog, the noise and the fire should have been a cue to panic, to swim blindly away from the danger. But Judy did the opposite. Survivors treading water, their eyes stinging from the oil, reported seeing a liver and white head bobbing through the waves, moving not towards safety, but toward the struggling men. She swam to those who couldn't swim, allowing them to grab her flank while she towed them toward floating crates and timber. When she couldn't tow them, she pushed debris in their direction. In the terrifying expanse of the ocean, amidst the screaming and the dying, the dog was working. Currents eventually pushed the survivors, a ragged group of British sailors and civilians, onto the shores of an uninhabited island called Posick. They dragged themselves up the beach, exhausted, burnt, and covered in crude oil. They had survived the bombs and the sea, but they had landed in a green hell. The island was a dense, humid jungle, tangled with mangroves and swarming with insects. But its deadliest feature was what it lacked. There was no fresh water. 24 hours passed, then 48. The tropical sun baked the beach, turning the sand into a skillet. Thirst began to set in, a torture far worse than hunger. Tongues swelled in mouths that felt like they were filled with cotton. Some of the men, delirious with dehydration, began to eye the ocean, tempted by the salt water that would surely kill them. The discipline of the Royal Navy began to fray at the edges. They had survived the enemy only to die of thirst on a rock in the middle of nowhere. Judy was suffering too. Her coat was matted with oil, her ribs were beginning to show, and her panting was dry and raspy. But while the men sat in the shade, conserving their dying energy, Judy vanished into the tree line. A few sailors noticed her absence and, fearing she had gone off to die alone, went looking for her. They found her at the base of a large tree, well back from the shoreline. She was digging. Her paws were flying, tearing at the earth with a frantic, obsessive intensity. Her nose was buried deep in the dirt, snuffling and whining. The men watched, confused. Was she digging for a bone? A rodent? Judy stopped, looked up at them with mud-caked eyes, gave a sharp bark, and went back to digging. One of the sailors, driven by a sudden, desperate intuition, dropped to his knees beside her. He pushed his hands into the hole she had created. The soil was damp. He shouted for a shovel. They dug wider and deeper, following the dog's lead. A foot down, the miracle happened. Crystal clear, cool water began to seep into the basin of the hole. It was a limestone spring, hidden beneath the surface, undetectable to human senses, but singing out to the ancient instincts of the animal. The cry went up, water. Men wept as they lined up to drink from the muddy pool. They filled canteens and washed the oil from their eyes. That evening, as they sat around a small fire, the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Judy was no longer a mascot they kept for amusement. She was the reason they were still breathing. In the flickering light of the campfire, she wasn't just a dog anymore. She was the savior of the Grasshopper survivors. The survivors of the Grasshopper trekked through the Sumatran jungle for weeks, a ragtag column of exhausted men and one determined dog, hacking through 200 miles of dense, green hell. Judy proved her worth every step of the way. Ever watchful, she acted as the unit's scout, alerting the men to snakes, approaching patrols, and even the presence of a tiger stalking them from the undergrowth. But nature wasn't the cruelest enemy. Time was. When they finally emerged from the jungle, hoping for rescue, they were met with a crushing realization. They had missed the last British evacuation boat by just 9 days. The escape was over. They were captured in a Japanese-controlled village. The captivity had begun. The men knew that their captors would not take kindly to a dog. As they were loaded onto transport trucks to be moved from temporary holding areas at Padang to Belawan, and finally to Medan, they took a huge risk. They hid Judy under piles of empty rice sacks in the back of the trucks. She seemed to understand the stakes, lying motionless for hours as the convoy rumbled toward their final destination, the notorious Glogoa camp. Glogoa was a place designed to strip a man of his dignity before killing him. The air smelled of dysentery, unwashed bodies, and despair. Rations were less than starvation level, a handful of worm-ridden rice a day. In this environment, survival was a zero-sum game. In those early, chaotic weeks, Judy was kept alive by the kindness of a few desperate men, specifically Les Searle and Private Cousins. Cousins, who was forced to work making leather goods for the Japanese, resorted to heartbreaking measures to keep the mascot alive. He would smuggle scraps of tough, cured leather from his workstation, soaking them in water to soften them up for Judy to chew. It was barely food, but it was an act of love. Tragically, the camp claimed Cousins quickly. He succumbed to malaria, leaving Judy alone once more. Among the prisoners was leading aircraftman Frank Williams, who had arrived at Glower in 1942. He watched the dog closely. He noticed that while she was a morale booster for everyone, men would occasionally toss her a scrap of rice or even pick maggots out of their rations to feed her. She was effectively an orphan. She belonged to everyone, which meant she belonged to no one. Without a specific guardian to claim her, she was vulnerable. Frank decided to take that burden on himself. One evening, seeing her staring at him with hollow, intelligent eyes, he made a decision that defied the brutal logic of the camp. He took his entire ration of rice, the only fuel keeping him alive that day, and slid it toward her. Judy ate gratefully, then sat back and rested her head on his knee. From that moment on, she never left his side. In that silent exchange, a pact was sealed. Frank Williams didn't just gain a dog. He took on a responsibility that would define the rest of his war. But love alone couldn't protect her from the rifle butts of the guards. Frank knew that as long as Judy was an undocumented stray, she was fair game. He needed to make her official. He needed to make her visible in a way the Japanese bureaucracy would respect. It was a plan so audacious it bordered on insanity. The camp commandant, Colonel Tadao, was a man known for his violent temper, but also for his fondness for sake. Frank waited for a night when Tadao was deep in his cups, roaring drunk and relatively approachable. With his heart hammering against his ribs, Frank approached the officer with the camp's official prisoner registry. He pointed to the dog, then to the book, and offered a bribe. Perhaps a puppy from a future litter. Perhaps just the amusement of a drunk man. Miraculously, Tadao laughed. He picked up his pen and scribbled in the ledger. In that drunken stroke of ink, Judy ceased to be a stray. She was officially registered as a prisoner of war. Her name was entered into the imperial records. She was assigned a number, 81A. The status of POW 81A changed everything. It gave her a bizarre form of diplomatic immunity. When guards threatened to shoot her, Frank would stand his ground, pointing out that killing a registered prisoner was a violation of army regulations. It was a bluff, but in the rigid hierarchy of the Japanese military, it worked. Judy repaid this protection with a devotion that became legendary. She appointed herself the camp's sentry. Her hearing, sharpened by the jungle, could distinguish the heavy, hobnailed footsteps of the Japanese guards from the shuffling gait of the prisoners. When the guards were approaching the barracks for a surprise inspection or a beat-up session, Judy would let out a low, specific growl. It was the signal to hide the contraband, the forbidden diaries, the handmade radios, the extra food. By the time the guards kicked open the doors, the prisoners were standing innocent and attentive, their secrets safe. But her bravery went beyond warnings. One afternoon, a guard began to beat Frank with the butt of his rifle, a common, casual brutality in Glower. The other men looked away, powerless to intervene. Judy did not. With a snarl that sounded like tearing metal, she launched herself at the guard, snapping at his legs and forcing him to back off. The guard raised his rifle to shoot her, but the commotion drew the attention of an officer. The beating stopped. Frank was bruised and bloodied, but alive. Judy stood over him, hackles raised, teeth bared, daring anyone to touch him again. In the hell of Glower, where men were reduced to numbers, prisoner 81A had become the keeper of their humanity. She was the only one among them who could still fight back. By June 1944, the tide of the war was turning. The Allies were storming the beaches of Normandy, but on the other side of the world, for the prisoners of the Japanese Empire, the nightmare was descending into a new, terrifying phase. The Japanese High Command began moving thousands of POWs from Singapore and Sumatra to unknown destinations to be used as slave labor. They were packed into the holds of unmarked merchant vessels, ships that would become known to history as hell ships. Frank Williams and Judy were ordered aboard the SS Van Warwick. The conditions were suffocating. Hundreds of men were crammed into cargo holds designed for rubber and tin, baking in the tropical heat with no sanitation. Frank knew that a dog would never be allowed on board, so he improvised. He trained Judy to lie perfectly still inside an empty rice sack. He carried her on his back, a heavy, breathing burden, past the guards and down into the dark, stifling belly of the ship. For days, they lived in that iron casket, sharing stale air and whispers. But the greatest danger wasn't the heat or the guards. It was their own countrymen. The British Royal Navy, unaware that the ship was carrying Allied prisoners, was hunting in these waters. On June 26th, the submarine HMS Truculent spotted the Van Wervik. The captain fired 2 torpedoes. The impact was catastrophic. The explosion tore the ship open. Water rushed into the hold, bringing with it the screams of trapped men and the grinding sound of twisting metal. In the pandemonium, Frank managed to force a hatch open. The ship was listing violently, sinking fast. He grabbed Judy, dragged her to the railing, and looked down at the dark, oil-slicked water 15 feet below. He didn't want to let her go, but he had no choice. He threw her into the sea and shouted the command she knew best. "Go!" Frank jumped seconds later. The ocean was an inferno of drowning men, burning fuel, and debris. He swam for his life, gasping for air, scanning the waves for a white head. He saw nothing. But Judy hadn't swum away. Just as she had done 2 years earlier, after the Grasshopper sinking, she stayed in the kill zone. Survivors later recounted seeing the dog paddling through the wreckage, pushing pieces of floating timber toward men who were too weak to swim. She allowed drowning sailors to grab onto her back, towing them to larger rafts. In the midst of a massacre caused by friendly fire, the dog was once again the only one thinking clearly. Frank was eventually pulled from the water by a Japanese corvette. He was beaten, tied up, and thrown onto the deck. He strained his neck, watching the Van Warwick slip beneath the waves, taking hundreds of his friends with it. He scanned the debris field until his eyes burned, but there was no sign of her. For the first time in 2 years, Frank Williams was truly alone. The grief hit him harder than the rifle butts. He was convinced Judy was dead. He was transported to a new camp in the heart of the Sumatran jungle, a place called the Gloea Rubber Estate. The work was backbreaking, but Frank moved through it like a ghost. He had lost his anchor. The will to survive, which he had borrowed from Judy every day, was evaporating. Weeks passed. Then, a rumor began to circulate through the camp barbed wire. The new arrivals whispered about a ghost dog that had been seen in the jungle, shadowing the Japanese patrols. Others said the Japanese soldiers had captured a dog at the riverbank and were fattening it up for a feast. Frank refused to hope. It was too painful. But one morning, a commotion erupted near the camp gates. A Japanese transport truck rumbled in, and soldiers began unloading supplies. Behind the truck, tied to a bumper with a piece of rough twine, was a creature that barely resembled a dog. She was skeletal, her coat matted with mud and grease, a wound festering on her shoulder. Frank froze. The dog lifted her head. She sniffed the air, navigating through the stench of the camp, searching for a specific frequency. Then she saw him. The reaction was visceral. Judy let out a howl that stopped the entire camp. She snapped the twine with a surge of adrenaline and bolted. She didn't run. She flew across the compound. She hit Frank with such force that she knocked him into the dirt. She licked his face, whining, barking, her tail beating a frantic rhythm against the ground. Frank buried his face in her neck, sobbing uncontrollably. The Japanese guards raised their rifles, shouting, ready to end the scene. But the camp commandant, perhaps moved by the sheer raw power of the reunion, or perhaps recognizing the famous prisoner 81A, lowered his hand. He let them be. Frank and Judy had both walked out of the grave. They were battered, starving, and surrounded by enemies, but they were together. And as they would soon find out, they would need every ounce of that bond to survive the final, deadliest chapter of the war, the construction of the Sumatra Railway. The final year of the war brought Frank and Judy to the heart of darkness, the Pakan-Barrow Railway. It was a project of monumental cruelty, a line of steel cut through the virgin rainforest of Sumatra by the emaciated hands of slave laborers. If the camps in Singapore were a prison, the railway was a slaughterhouse. The heat was a physical weight, the air swarming with malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and the jungle floor crawling with leeches. Men dropped dead where they stood, their bodies pushed into the mud to make way for the next sleeper. In this green cathedral of death, the bond between man and dog shifted into something primal. They were no longer just companions. They were a single organism fighting for existence. Frank was wasting away, his body ravaged by malaria and dysentery. He was too weak to work, which in the logic of the railway meant he was marked for disposal. Judy took charge. She understood that the rice rations were insufficient. Reverting to the instincts of her wolf ancestors, she began to hunt. She would vanish into the undergrowth for hours, returning with rats, snakes, or even monkeys. She brought them to Frank. She would drop the fresh kill at his feet, nudging him, demanding he eat. In the civilized world, it would have been grotesque. Here, it was the purest form of love. She was feeding him life, bite by bite. But the jungle was not hers to rule. It belonged to the tigers and the crocodiles. On one occasion, a crocodile lunged from the riverbank, its jaws snapping inches from her spine. On another, she faced down a Sumatran tiger that was stalking the camp perimeter, barking with such ferocious, suicidal insolence that the great cat actually turned and slipped back into the shadows. She bore the scars of these battles, a patchwork of torn skin and matted fur, but she never abandoned her post at Frank's side. Then, on August 15th, 1945, the silence broke. The atomic bombs had fallen. The Emperor had surrendered. The war was over. The announcement didn't bring immediate joy. The men were too broken for celebration. It brought a stunned, hollow relief. But for Frank Williams, the end of hostilities brought a new, bureaucratic nightmare. The British military command issued a strict order. No animals were to board the troopships home. Due to fear of rabies and disease, all pets acquired during the war were to be left behind or destroyed. Frank read the order. He looked at Judy, the dog who had saved him from drowning, who had fought tigers, who had starved so he could eat. He looked at the officer in charge and made a vow. If Judy wasn't going, neither was he. He would stay in the jungle of Sumatra forever rather than leave her behind. He hatched a plan. It was a smuggling operation that required the complicity of his fellow survivors. They built a custom crate, disguised as equipment storage. They trained Judy, once again, to lie motionless and silent. When the troopship SS Antenor arrived to take them to Liverpool, Frank carried the heavy box up the gangway himself. His heart hammered against his ribs harder than it ever had during the bombing raids. One bark, one whine, and she would be thrown overboard. But keeping a dog hidden on a crowded troopship for weeks was impossible for one man. It became a conspiracy of kindness. Even the ship's cook, a man who could have reported the breach of protocol, chose a different path. Instead of raising the alarm, he joined the plot. Every day, he smuggled prime cuts of meat from the galley down to the hold, ensuring the stowaway war hero ate better than the officers on deck. She didn't make a sound. She stayed silent for the entire voyage, hidden in the bowels of the ship, visited in secret by the men who owed her their lives. It wasn't until the ship docked in Liverpool and the chaotic joy of homecoming erupted that Frank finally let her out. She walked down the gangplank onto British soil, an illegal immigrant, a war hero, and the only dog in history to survive the full circuit of the Far East campaign. Her story could not be contained. The press fell in love with her. She wasn't just a dog. She was a symbol of resilience that a war-weary nation desperately needed. In May 1946, in a ceremony packed with reporters and veterans, Judy was awarded the Dickin Medal, the Victoria Cross for Animals. Her citation was read aloud, praising her magnificent courage and endurance in Japanese prison camps, which helped to maintain morale among her fellow prisoners. But the medals and the flashbulbs were not what mattered. What mattered was the quiet peace that followed. Frank and Judy spent the next few years inseparable. They travelled together to Tanzania for Frank's work, seeking a life far away from the grey skies of post-war England. In 1950, at the age of 13, Judy's health began to fail. A tumour, perhaps a legacy of the toxic environment she had survived, took hold. Frank stayed with her until the very end, holding the paw that had once paddled through burning oil to save him. When she took her last breath, Frank Williams did not wrap her in a blanket or a simple sheet. He opened his trunk and pulled out his Royal Air Force service tunic, the uniform he had worn with pride, the symbol of his service. He wrapped the jacket around her small, scarred body. He buried her there in East Africa, building a monument of granite and marble. On the plaque, he ordered an inscription that summarized the impossible journey of the stray from Shanghai. It didn't list her breed or her pedigree. It simply read, Judy, a golden heart. Prisoner of War 81A. a girl who gave more companionship than many human beings and who had the courage of a lion. Her war was over. The dog who refused to die had finally found her rest.